Hello, everyone, and welcome to Transformation as Strategy, a podcast brought to you by the experts at Roland Berger Americas, where we explore fresh perspectives and practical strategies to help business owners create a lasting competitive edge. I'm your host, Mackenzie Puddesy, and the topic for this episode is powering the data center boom and the trends shaping U.S. energy and utility demand. Joining me for today's conversation is Mike Granowski, partner and head of energy and utilities in North America at Roland Berger Americas. Hello, Mike, and welcome to the show.
Hi, Mackenzie. Thanks for having me today.
Of course. Excited to have you here. So to start us off, Mike, could you tell us just a little bit more about your role at Roland Berger?
Yes. I lead the energy and utility practice in what we call our regulated and infrastructure platform. So we cover energy from upstream through midstream, gas and oil. Our focus is primarily downstream on electric and natural gas utilities and the ecosystem around that. So we will serve the equipment manufacturers who serve the electric and natural gas industry, as well as the investors and some of the service companies as well.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So as AI-driven data center growth accelerates, power availability has become a critical constraint, of course. And so I want to dig in here off the top and ask you, how are data center operators securing access to reliable power today? And what does the rise of direct nuclear power agreements signal for the future of energy procurement?
Well, we've seen, I think, a very interesting evolution in the power aspirations and requirements for the main hyperscalers and the data center developers. We've gone from, in the last 4 years, 100% renewable to 100% clean, and really what is a power now, clean later strategy. And so we're seeing quite a bit of the low-hanging fruit, I'll call it, get snapped up in the form of direct PPAs with nuclear plants, as you referenced. I think the most famous is AWS and Talon with the Susquehanna plant. It's over 2 gigawatts, and they're taking most of that output. We're seeing another a trend as well where plants are being life extended and uprated. And you're seeing perhaps the Meta deal with Vistra, where that's an element of the power purchase agreements that they're executing, and we're going to see that elsewhere. From the low-hanging fruit, we're seeing some more difficult access to nuclear, and it is in the form of opening previously closed and even in some cases partially decommissioned plants. The Crane Energy Center, formerly 3 Mile Island, is very famous one there. There are others. Palisades is being reopened by Holtec, and you've got Duane Arnold that's looking as though it may get reopened. Kewaunee may get repowered. So you've got a great interest in nuclear power as a clean source that you can get now. Now that's got a short runway to it, and the power requirements or the demands for the data centers will exceed, that quantity of capacity to be had. And so you're seeing a number of deals being done. These are longer term in nature, and this is part of the clean later strategy of many of the hyperscalers and developers of working directly with nuclear OEMs to fund and develop nuclear power plants for data center power consumption in the not so distant future. So, a spectrum of activity along the nuclear topic, and we're seeing all of it being executed almost on a daily basis now today.
Exciting stuff. I feel some of these older nuclear plants that are being brought up, they almost have this storybook or film-like persona in history. So it's interesting to just know that that's happening and to see it happening. And then I want to kind of pick your brain a little bit around what are these kind of newer, smaller reactors that are kind of hitting the market or that people are looking into? Because I've heard that there's some that are just small. You can almost drop them anywhere, or they could be more for like one city, something of that nature.
Well, we should, give respect where it is due, and there is a large conventional alternative. The AP 1000. We've built several of them in China. We've built two of them in Georgia. To some, not so good fanfare on the schedule and the budget, but those reactors are probably going to run for 80 to 100 years, and they're going to be a very solid, reliable, clean performing asset for a very long time. And so, you see it in the news where Westinghouse and Brookfield, who owns a portion of Westinghouse, the $80 billion deal with the current administration, the LPO came out yesterday, literally with 17 billion in loan support for that program. And we want to build, it's a goal that's been set, 10 of those reactors in North America. So that's 10 gigawatts. Great. That's only a portion of what we're going to need to, and a small portion at that, to power what the aspirations are of the hyperscalers and the data center developers. So there's a new class of asset that is small modular reactors, SMRs, as people call them. Some of them are light water reactors like the AP 1000. Those are being constructed right now. You've got construction underway on the GE Hitachi technology in Canada. There are others waiting in the wings to deploy that technology. The interesting part of the SMR landscape is what's called Generation 4 here in the United States, or AMR in Europe. And these are reactors that are not based on light water. They're based on other coolants, other moderators. And the thing about those is that they are an order of magnitude safer than light water. Now, that's not saying that the Vogel and AP 1000 and all of the SMRs that are based on light water are not very safe. These plants are designed such that the reactor cannot be put in condition where the fuel can melt. And so when we look at what the data centers and hyperscalers are doing, they're partnering with the Gen 4 reactor designers. And they're doing so because of that inherent safety. It is literally walk away and walk back with many of these designs where it cannot put itself into a condition where the fuel is damaged. So that's a very popular thing. And you could look at AWS with X Energy, Meta with X Energy, Google is with Kairos, Microsoft obviously is with TerraPower. Mr. Gates is funding TerraPower, a nuclear OEM. So we see a great deal of interest in this more advanced, safer technology, and because of that safety, you could really put those facilities just about anywhere. I worked at a nuclear power plant at the beginning of my career. We had a 10-mile emergency zone around the plant. And it was because if something went sideways at the plant and you lived within that zone, you'd get a phone call. It's not the phone call, obviously, you want to get, but with these newer Gen 4 technologies, the emergency planning zone is at the building wall. So, I mean, it is that much safer that you can, basically put it right downtown if you would like. I don't think that's going to happen, but you can certainly put it next to an industrial facility like X Energy is doing with Dow Chemical in Texas, and you can put it in proximity to population. Whereas with the older designs, very safe, very reliable, you didn't put them as close to population centers as you can with these.
That's incredible. And I think I imagine it puts a lot of people at ease because before, I just think there's so much fear and stigma around nuclear and some of these kind of big meltdowns that have happened throughout history. So knowing that you couldn't even enter the conditions to have that should, hopefully have people feeling much more relaxed and excited to take this on.
It's a very strong selling point, and one that has convinced what were formerly, not very popular nuclear people in the hyperscaler industry. And I think in communities, and especially in the younger demographics of the population, it's a clean technology. Why aren't we using it? So I think you'll see quite a bit of change along the lines of, is nuclear good? Should we use it? I think that we're past the no nukes phase of our demographic, if you will.
Gotcha. Well, exciting. You mentioned a few big names there: AWS, Brookfield, Meta. So there's definitely been significant investor interest in nuclear energy, but valuations alone don't tell this full story, I imagine. So I wanted to ask you, what milestones should industry leaders watch to determine if nuclear deployment is truly gaining this momentum that we might be expecting, and is it if it's able to scale?
Well, I think, one of the things you just touched on, valuations, is that there has been pretty strong market receptivity for the nuclear technology. And so a number of companies have gone public, IPO or SPAC, or however you want to characterize it, but they've accessed the public capital markets, and the response has been reasonably positive. Now, you see fluctuations in valuation, from day to day, month to month. But the just the fact that these new companies can access capital markets and do so in a way that is, reasonably valued is a great positive. So that alone is something that we wanted to see a couple of years ago, is that we could access public markets. I think there's a number of other milestones that we've been starting to see. We'd like to see accelerate. When Atkins Realis signed the real deal with Ontario Power Gen to repower Darlington, that was a watershed moment. We had an EPC that signed up to do the construction. We want to see more of that. We've seen a lot of deals of interest or memorandums of understanding, and we'll make a deal later kind of deals. We'd like to see more of the real ironclad. We're going to actually build this and put shovels in the ground. Deals get done. And I think we'll see those in the next 12, 18, 24 months. And that will be another big milestone that people will be making commitments and spending real money and starting to move ground and put facilities into construction. So we'd like to see more of that. The other thing that I think we're seeing beyond the public capital that's being brought to bear on the industry is private capital is also being brought to bear. And so when you think about, there's two avenues that are very positive. One, there's a great deal of interest in nuclear component manufacturers, whether it's existing entities rolling up smaller, or private capital interested in rolling up that kind of production capability. There are real money bets being made on this being a long run and solid business. The other thing that's lining up is capital that will be deployed to construct these facilities. So typically, you will have a construction capital stack. Once it's done, it goes to an ownership capital stack. That construction capital stack, while very nascent, is starting to take shape. And again, that's a very important milestone to getting facilities in the ground, constructed, and in operation.
Thanks for that, Mike. I think that was a great lay of the land there. And before we go a bit deeper, I feel like anyone listening is probably pretty interested in nuclear at this point, but I'd be curious to get kind of a brief overview of, if we're questioning the idea of, is this scalable? Is this sort of what's going to take us into the future and some of those demands? Where does it sort of compare this at this point with some of the other options, if we're looking at hydro or solar or other power options?
Yeah, I think in the U.S., I should say, and I can't say North America because Canada has aspirations to build quite a bit of hydro. They still have the capacity in many of their waterways to do so. The United States, we probably are not going to build any significant hydro going into the future. We have a good deal of it already. It is, in many ways, environmentally challenged. They are huge projects. You do dam up rivers, and there are impacts associated with that. But by and large, we've done pretty much all that we can do on a large scale to begin with. Wind, solar, storage are going to have their role. I think those roles will vary as we look into the future. But one of the most energy dense, reliable, always on, and dispatchable resources is nuclear. And for the data center load profile and energy requirements, it fits the nuclear bill a lot better than the intermittent, nature of wind solar, even when it's matched with storage. So there are very few other solutions today that can fit that bill. You could go and look at carbon capture and sequestration. That's geographically challenged. You can only do that in certain spots where you can actually sequester the carbon. And people talk about nuclear waste as being a long time problem. Carbon in the ground is a forever problem. If that carbon comes out, we're going to have a lot of problems. And then there are others we could look at. We could look at hydrogen, extraordinarily expensive, multiples of how much nuclear costs. So that's not a great idea for baseload power or for dispatchable power as well. Geothermal, very nascent right now. Again, geographically challenged. If you've got good geography, you can do geothermal. It's a great resource. There's some advances being made, and we can talk later about what the what the future looks like. But today, if you want clean, dispatchable power, nuclear is what you've got, and people are taking advantage of it.
Exciting stuff. So yeah, thanks for doing that as well. And I want to talk a little bit more about some of those barriers that experts are citing around scaling nuclear. Now that we've kind of got all the cards on the table. Mm-hmm. And then also, what would it take to accelerate deployment? And where do you see the most critical bottlenecks going on right now today?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are a number of things that need to be stood up or re-stood up in order to facilitate a large build out of nuclear. Fuel is a big one. We had been getting quite a bit of our fuel from Russia. And in particular, Russia provided a kind of fuel called HALEU. It's a higher enriched fuel that is going to go into a number of the Generation 4 reactor designs. And we're not going to be getting HALEU from Russia. So we need to stand that fuel supply chain up ourselves. We need more enrichment. We need more fabrication. We're going to need more uranium mining. So we need all of those things to support any kind of growth in any way that we see in nuclear going forward. So that's a big concern. Now, the U.S. government has been behind it for multiple administrations to stand those supply chains up, to make it easier to build the facilities, to build the mines, etc. So that is underway. The other thing that I think is a limiting factor, and it's not often talked about, is going to be the people to actually build and operate the plants. We need engineers, and not just nuclear engineers. We need mechanical engineers. We need electrical engineers, and even beyond that, just pure craft and tradespeople, mechanics, pipe fitters, electricians, instrument techs. There's a finite supply. And we're building a lot of things in the United States today, and we're all going to be drawing from that finite supply of engineers and craft labor. So that's going to have to change. And we have a lot of programs in place to make that happen. They're going to be great jobs. I think that's going to be a very good thing for the economy. But we've got to build that up from a place where it was kind of a steady state doldrums to a more growth trajectory type of profile on that kind of resource.
All right. So if you're a university student out there, you might want to think about getting into an engineering role for this.
There will be plenty of spots open.
Excellent. Mike, you mentioned the government's, the last few administrations have been pretty solid and cohesive around support for this. I want to go a little deeper around what you think the role government should play in enabling this next generation of nuclear projects. And
yeah, that's
what aspects of the industry should the public policy focus on specifically?
Well, I'll talk about direct government support first. and then deal with the NRC or the regulatory environment second. And so, for a number of administrations now, it doesn't depend Republican or Democrat. We've had great support for the nuclear industry, and you can see that with like early advanced reactor programs supporting. I mentioned the Dow Chemical and X Energy facility that's supported heavily by the DOE. The DOE also has a loan program office that I mentioned earlier. The support for the development of AP1000s, and giving some kind of line of sight for investors to have some modicum of guarantee on loaning dollars is extremely important. One of the things that we hear from not just our utility clients, but the end users, the hyperscalers and others, developers who would develop these facilities, is some kind of a backstop on cost overrun, particularly for the first of a kind, first couple of a kind of reactors that are going to be built. And I kind of liken it to, we have this thing called Price Anderson in the nuclear industry. It is an insurance backstop. A nuclear plant, if things go really bad, it can get really bad. So insurance companies get nervous about that. The government backstops it. So I could see something where the government has a fail safe. If things go really bad, okay, you can access this facility. I mean, I'm sure there will be strings and penalties attached, but there's a backstop that gives people comfort that they're not, exposed, infinitely to cost overrun. So, I don't know that the DOE is talking about that. I do know several people in the industry who are talking about something like that, but that would be very supportive of early stage development in particular. The NRC always comes up. The NRC, it's joked over the years, their job is to say no. I think that with a number of pieces of legislation from the last administration through this one has, I think, reset the focus of the NRC to take advantage of the clean aspect of nuclear, the national security and energy security aspect of nuclear in the United States. And I think we're going to see that projects be adjudicated more quickly with the NRC than we have in the past, and that will be important. The last thing that I will mention with the NRC is related to the Generation 4 reactor designs. When you look at 10 CFR 5059, and that's the safety evaluation of nuclear power plants in the Code of Federal Regs, it's all based on light water. So 90% of what you see in there is light water related safety design aspects. So anticipated transient without scram or loss of coolant. Those are all light water problems. When you get to Gen 4, those are not Gen 4 problems. So a lot of what's in the safety regs right now simply don't apply. So we have been hearing, you may hear about Part 53 of that is supposed to be for advanced designs. We'd really like to see the NRC be able to deal with the designs based on their design, not based what's in the current federal regs. So we'd like to see that come to fruition as well, where you'll have to deal with a lot of other stuff, seismic, fire, cybersecurity, all of those things. But when it comes to the reactor designs, as I mentioned earlier, these Gen 4 reactors don't have the problems that light water reactors have to design for.
So, Mike, as I listen to, I feel that we have sort of a legacy of nuclear. We have some new things being built and being brought up to life and modernized now. We have some things around the corner, but it's hard to really know, where are we? Are we late? Are we early? Where are we in nuclear right now? And what is sort of just around the corner? Is this something we're going to start seeing quickly, or 5 years, 50 years?
Well, we had a nuclear renaissance, quote unquote, in the 2000s. And that brought a number of early site permits. A lot of utilities looked at constructing nuclear power plants. The only ones that came out of that were Vogtle 3 and 4. So that was an environment, however, where certain things are no longer true. So we were flush with capacity in the 2000s, and there's a number of reasons for that that I won't go into. That long capacity situation does not exist any longer. The other thing that did not exist in the 2000s was this demand growth. And the growth isn't just hyperscalers and data center developers. We've got building electrification, we've got transportation electrification, and reindustrialization in the United States, reshoring of supply chains, nearshoring of supply chains, et cetera. All of those things are combining to create a growth picture that we really haven't seen since before the 90s, and even goes back to the 1970s. But we've dealt with this in the past, and that's what's different. So you're not only replacing existing stock, you are growing, and you need net new. And so the net new is a portion of that is nuclear. Clearly, we're building a lot of gas because we could do that quickly and do it today. But that's going to run out of runway as well. And nuclear is what we're planning on doing in the 30s and lining up to make the things that need to happen to support that.
So I think you've left some really good bread crumbs along the trail here, so people might have a sense of where you're going to go with this answer. But I want to ask, looking ahead to say 2050 and beyond, what do you expect the power generation mix to look like, and what role do you expect nuclear to play alongside some of those things we touched on with renewables, the geothermal, and are some of those also getting some interesting innovations as well?
Yeah, it's another very good question. I'll start with wind solar storage. We are going to have renewable as a pretty big mix of our fuel mix going forward. I think what we're going to see is more storage and solar than we see wind. Solar is very easy to build. You need a field that's not shaded, and you can put a solar plant just about anywhere. I mean, it's sad that the sun goes down every night and it gets dark in the wintertime, but it is a reasonably predictable asset and is not prone to large outages over great geographies. Yeah, it gets cloudy, but it's typically cloudy in a local area, not over vast swaths of the country. Wind, on the other hand, is more challenged. We have taken up most of the good wind places that are easily connected to the grid. We're now looking at places where we have to build billions of dollars of transmission to get wind into the load centers. And wind, unfortunately, in many places, it blows when you don't want it to blow at night, during the spring and during the fall. And then, and this is a phenomenon that we've seen both on our continent and on the European continent, the wind can stop. And when it's not windy, it can be not windy over a vast geographical area. And so, it's got to be windy somewhere. That's not a very true adage. Yes, it'll be sunny somewhere, but wind, unfortunately, has those what they call in Europe doldrums, where it's just not windy, and then that resource is not working. So those will be, the challenges there. Storage is a great resource to support solar. As you know, the duck curve in California pushes the peak into the evening, and the storage can help clip that peak. It's very good. Storage is not, however, something that can handle, say, a 7-day wind outage in the central part of the United States. So there has to be something else. And people realize that we do need dispatchable, reliable, clean energy. And, we kind of call it, it's the great horse race going into the late 2030s and early 2040s. Is it going to be nuclear? And then within that, is it going to be fission or is it going to be fusion? And then I think the dark horse in this race, as we've been characterizing to many of our clients, is geothermal. So if you could punch a hole in the ground 30 to maybe 50,000 feet, you can have geothermal anywhere. You don't need to have it outside of Yellowstone. You don't need to have it, near a fault or where the, magma is pushing up close to the surface of the earth. I mean, you can have it outside of Chicago. You can have it outside of Pittsburgh. And that is a very interesting, possibility. Geothermal, it is dispatchable, it's always on, it's clean. And if we can get these drilling technologies to work, it could be reasonably inexpensive as well. So it'll be very interesting to see, out of those clean dispatchable options, which are the ones that win and when they win.
Interesting. Do I dare ask you what you think? What's going to win?
Well, I think we're going to, as I look out to 2050, I think we're going to have a lot of legacy natural gas still on the system. That will be there. I don't think we're going to have very many coal plants operating. We'll have a lot of, wind, solar storage. I think we're going to have a lot of gigawatts of nuclear fission. And that's just going to be a legacy of the 2030s. What'll be interesting is if these newer technologies, fusion and advanced geothermal, can become commercializable, and the extent to which they can start to penetrate the fuel mix by that point. It's a matter of time for fusion. I'm less matter of time for advanced geothermal. It's no small feat to dig or to drill a hole that deep in the crust to access the kind of heat you need for reliable geothermal.
All right. So I'm hearing there's a huge case for nuclear here, a pretty good case for solar, and then a little bit of a mixed support of legacy, and we'll see what comes out. So, Mike, we've been talking about this growing demand, the ability for us to sort of start filling that demand. We live in an interesting world where there's some places that have pretty abundant energy, others that sometimes have outages. There's data deserts, all these things. Going forward, how real is this demand? How real do you project this growth boom that we're having for data centers, for AI usage, among all the other things that we're using and powering today? Are you bullish on the long-term growth in energy demand driven by AI and all these things I mentioned? Or do you think the current projections are overestimating what's actually needed or going to be needed?
Yeah, we're going to go through the hype cycle, such as it is. But I think at the end, I'm more bullish on power demand, and that power demand is really the precursor for information demand. And as it's predicated on the ability for us to be able to produce reasonably priced power on demand, and scale that. If we can do those things, I think that we'll find that there are uses that we don't even consider today that we will be using that power for in the future. One of the metaphors or examples that I like to take a look at is what happened to telecom. And so telecom was a $10 a month. You've got a wall-mounted rotary phone. Became a push-button phone, was a big innovation. But when you consider what information, what service, what utility you were getting from that, in let's say the 80s, to what you're getting today with the iPhone in your hand, it's night and day. And I think you're going to see the same thing for things that we electrify. We're going to electrify our transportation to a large extent. We're going to electrify our homes and our buildings to a large extent. And I think we're going to rely on information services that we can't even contemplate today that are going to require very large amounts of power. And it'll be something that you don't even think about paying when you pay a couple $100s for a cell bill, today. It has no relationship to what you paid for telecommunication services decades ago. So I think we're going to see something of a similar nature. If it's as big a trajectory, I don't know. but I think we're going to follow a trajectory similar to that.
Mm. No, it is true. I think before it was like, do I need this? It was almost optional, right? Whereas now it's like anyone and everyone's, I need the phone, as much data as possible. I need
Yes.
that continuous access. So now you just have me thinking of what's around the corner that I haven't even thought about yet, Mike.
Yeah, so I'd be on the bullish end of the spectrum.
Alrighty, Mike. Well, thank you for your valuable insights today. And with that, we're going to wrap up this episode. Mike, again, thanks. This has been a really wonderful conversation. I appreciate everything you've shared with us and the strategies that are going to help business owners navigate the nuclear energy landscape and know what to keep an eye on, where to spot opportunities. So thank you again for your time.
Absolutely, Mackenzie. Really appreciate the time spent today.
Absolutely. And for our listeners, if you'd like to learn more about what Mike and the team at Roland Berger Americas are working on, visit www.rolandberger.com. And if you're a fan of this show, please share it with your colleagues. And of course, be sure to follow us on Apple, Spotify, or Podigy.